For coming out today. And as we continue our lecture series, we have David Spears today, who's a longtime educator and photographer, and he has taught at Salish Kootenai College since 2002. David has a BA from the State University of New York, Empire State College, and a certificate in advanced studies from the International Center of Photography. He's also the author of a monograph titled Gas Smells But Not Like Skunks, which I think is quite interesting. He has many publication credits, but they include the New York Times Magazine, German Geo, Columbia Journalism Review, and Ode Magazine. As well, David has garnered many awards, including the Ernst Haas Photography Educator of the Year Award. His work was included in the first Montana Triennial exhibition in 2009, and a survey of his work was shown in 2010 at the Missoula Art Museum. Additionally, his photographs have been collected by the Salish and Pend Oreille Cultural Committee, so a wide range of places where he's been exhibited. Notably, in 1985, he developed the International Center of Photography's Community Outreach Program for underserved communities in New York City. And as well, following that, he developed a project at Two Eagle River School, now in its 10th year, titled Our Community Record. This project encourages students to explore and document their community, culture, and history through photographic studies and storytelling. So the title of his presentation today is Vision, Culture, and the Camera's Image. So please welcome David Spear.
Almost tripped. Thank you. Thanks for braving the weather. I'd like to thank Dr. Ross for including me in her talk. And while it's an honor to be a part of the series, for me, I'm not really a professor, though I will say that Urban Bear Don't Walk, who is one of my students, would call out in class sort of unexpectedly, professor. And we all know, if you have worked with Urban, you know his great sense of humor, but he's also a very serious student and actually a good photographer. I've come to teaching not necessarily steeped in academic tradition, instead with the need to share something I've come to know well and something I've worked on it for much of my life, this thing called photography. So I don't really teach, I share things. You see, my journey in photography has only changed, it has not only changed me, but has informed my life in many ways. So my journey into photographs is a very personal one, some of which I'll share. As one of 600 students in my urban Connecticut high school class, I was interested but a quiet student, so shy that my teachers suspected that I had a learning disability, which may have been indicated by the fact that I sat academically in the bottom quarter of my class. What I knew about myself then was that though I may have been a slow learner, that if something came my way that I became interested in, I would really immerse myself in it. As it turned out, I needed 6 credits late in my senior year to graduate. Personal typing offered 3 and photography the rest. In this first class, I became so enamored with the idea of the process of making photographs that even before I knew how to do it, I was proclaiming myself as a photographer. After graduation, while my classmates were heading off to college, I joined the union and became a construction laborer, specializing in concrete pours. I became really good then at carefully balancing a moving wheelbarrow full of concrete along a narrow plank and dumping each load precisely into the mason's tub without losing a drop of the mud. A year later, after I had saved some money, I applied to photography school in California. I probably should have applied to art school, but the idea of photography as art, at least at that point, hadn't occurred to me yet. As it turned out, to my parents' chagrin, did I miss a page? Okay, here we go. I jumped ahead of myself. A year later, after I'd saved some money, I applied to photography school in California. I probably should have applied to art school, and I said that already. As it turned out, the school I attended was training photographers to work commercially. It had a sound technical curriculum, but it also had a political agenda. I was there as a student at the height of the Vietnam War. A few days before a scheduled anti-war march, the FBI came to our school to recruit student photographers who they wanted to place on the roofs of the businesses along State Street to photograph these people they described then as anti-American. As it turned out, I marched in the parade because I was opposed to that war, and while I walked there with my friends perched atop the roofs overlooking the main thoroughfare were filled with marchers, were my fellow students. I would stop and make pictures of these classmates who had taken up the FBI's offer of free film and a meal. The problem for me, and perhaps for the school, was that the next day on the front page of the Santa Barbara News Press, the daily newspaper, was a large image of me amongst the crowd with my camera holding its long lens in my hand. As it turned out, to my parents' chagrin, I left this photography program 2 terms before I was to graduate, but I never left photography, and as it turned out, I became a teacher as well. One thing from this time that had a huge impact on me then was watching then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, and his agenda to dismantle the University of California college system. These series of colleges and universities at the time ran the breadth of the state, and very, very good education was available to any California resident at a very low cost. I had grown up in the East, and the cost of education wasn't something that everyone could afford. And I believe Reagan's efforts prevented equal education for all, and I felt this was very disheartening. Now, please bear with me, and you may be asking, do I really need to know all this information about David Spear? And while you won't hear any of this in the classes I teach, for today I say, yes, you need to know some more of this information. My father was a clergyman. My friends would call me a son of a preacher man. My mother was a nurse. Both worked hard at their vocations, and while both struggled with personal demons, each day they got up and went to work and were really good at what they did. I learned from my father patience to seek out the truth and to share all of what I have with anyone who needs help. I learned from my mother all the strength that is the makeup of every woman, and that each and every person deserves respect. They taught we 5 siblings these things that they believed, and though we didn't have a lot of money, we never went to bed hungry, and we were always safe. I feel very lucky to have been born and raised in this light. My parents loaded up 4 sons and moved to Panama before we started school. We stayed there for 6 years, and I was in 4th grade when we reemerged stateside. We resided in the U.S.-controlled Canal Zone area near Panama City in a small enclave community of Gamboa. My mother worked at the hospital on the late shift, and she would take a bus into the night and back while my father cared for and fed us dinner. She would serve our breakfast and sleep while we were at work. While we were at school, and would be up and returned, and when we returned from school, until my sister Martha was born, and then she was up most of the time. My father was a pastor in a church in which all of the parishioners, except for us, his family, were people of color. Because the Panama Canal was considered a part of the South, the federal law of segregation was enforced here. There was a line that ran through the middle of Gamboa. On one side of this line lived people of color. On the other side of the line lived white people. The line ran into and stopped in town at the grocery store, which sat on the bank of the Panama Canal. The store had the exact same food for sale on the white side and on the colored side. We lived and we were schooled on the white side, and we would walk or drive to the colored side to play and pray with our friends from church. At a very early age, I came to understand that even though my friends and I were equal in the eyes of the law, they were not considered so. But I also became very comfortable in moving back and forth between cultures because this was my experience of growing up. The image that haunts me even today from this time is from the pool. There was a swimming pool on the white side of the line, but not on the colored side. The high chain link fence that surrounded the pool area sat directly on the segregation line, and while I was not allowed to swim in the pool, while I was allowed to swim in the pool, my friends of color were not. The image of them when lifting my head from the water to breathe as I swam laps was one of my friends holding the wire of the fence in their hands above their heads and looking in on me as if they were prisoners. I will never forget that they were kept out and that they were kept from swimming with me because of their race. I lived and worked in New York for nearly 2 decades. One of the great things I experienced was being immersed in culture. And again, I remembered this as a child. One of my favorite things to do was to ride the subway to different parts of the city so that I could take in ethnic diversity of these various cultures. When I left New York and moved to Polson, one of my fears was that I would be trapped, culturally speaking, by an overabundance of what I saw as Northern European culture. But immediately upon moving here, the Salish Ponderean culture, Salish Ponderean Kootenai culture seemed to summon me. I've been very blessed in my friendships here, and whether you know it or not, many of you have taken me in. One day, Glenn Aragon of Wind River, who teaches art here, when we worked on campus in the darkness, said, "I've come up with your native name." And I said, "Oh." He said, "It's Injun Dave." Glenn and I, so you know, are dear friends. In 2008, I was wrongly accused and charged in a case in this county. I had to appear in court to make my plea of not guilty. As I stood before the judge 2 rows behind me in support, Glenn and other friends who had come to these proceedings on my behalf were there. The first question the judge asked me was my name, and I said David Spear. But I paused for a moment before answering and thought maybe I should reply Injun Dave. The judge asked the second question my birth date, and the third question my social security number. The last question he asked me before asked how I pleaded was, "Are you a tribal member or not?" In that moment, the image of my friends holding and leaning on the chain link fence at the edge of the swimming pool in Gamboa came streaming back. Everyone is equal, and everyone, I believe, should have the right to a good, affordable education. So now let's move on to some photographs. I gotta run. There it is. Okay, Taylor, can you flip that on for me? So it's a power switch. Thanks. It's the one that says on off. And just go all the way forward with it. Yeah, okay. So what I've done here is I'm going to try and show you a lot of images. I'll try to go quickly. The history of photography is this rich thing that from the context of visual imagery, we can have pictures. The first one is that picture worth 1,000 words? Does this picture tell us a story? Is this picture extraordinary? And what's really wonderful for me is that the idea of an image, in a lot of ways, kind of comes to us from a lot of different vantage points, that each of us has our own vision, each of us sees the world in a different way. And the kinds of subjects that we photograph and the kinds of things that people make pictures of are as various and different as we are as people. So sort of having you look at a few images that I share in some of my classes to sort of talk about issues of how a camera works and the impact of a photograph and those kinds of things. This next picture is really a visual representation of what I experienced as a young person. Elliot Irwit, who made the dog picture, was a renowned photographer who traveled the world on assignment, and one of the things that he photographed was the civil rights movement in the South. And this picture is visually used in a lot of textbooks and history books to kind of tell us what that whole issue was about in our history. And again, some photographs are difficult to be with, some photographs are horrible, but also the idea that photographs are important because they tell us things that people try to discredit. We know that things have happened, we know horrible things have happened, and a photograph has an important role in disseminating information to us. So when we hear people say that the Hitler and Nazi regime never existed, the great thing is that we have photographs to be able to sort of show that what it has occurred. And again, every picture isn't something that any of us might take, but the fact is that photographers immerse themselves in things and become interested in things in their lives and in society. W. Gene Smith's picture here, made in Japan in a small fishing village, Minamata, which essentially had been polluted by mercury poisoning. And this mother is actually bathing her child. The child is grown up now, but was born with mercury poisoning and can't care for itself anymore. So these are some of the kinds of pictures that have had incredible impact on me. Helen Levitt's work in East Harlem back in the 1930s and 40s. Margaret Borkwhite's Mahatma Gandhi photograph. This is Graciela Iturbide, who's a Mexican photographer, and she actually is really an important working photographer today. She's done a series of pictures in this small community, which is a matriarchy, where women actually control the politics, the culture, the whole deal, and her being a woman and her access to that based on who she is allows us to be able to go in there and be part of this from the context of the photograph. The last couple pictures I'll show you before we kind of move on to something else. This is Maud Callan. Maud Callan was a midwife and nurse who lived in the South, and W. Gene Smith was a photographer who back in the 1950s thought she would be really interesting to portray. She really becomes the first person of color who is put in Life magazine as a hero. He followed her. She worked in rural Kentucky, I believe. She had some 10,000 patients that she would walk to. She was at hundreds of births of different people. And she was really this person who, in a lot of ways, rose to the surface in terms of what a photographic essay was about. And I'm only going to show you 2 images here, but Life magazine had to struggle with the idea of actually publishing this story because the advertisers were going to pull out because we can't have an African-American person as a hero in the magazine. We don't support that. And it took a couple years for Smith to convince them that this was an important story. And ultimately, here she is caring for an elderly person. Ultimately, that story was run. And if you go online and plug in Maud Callan, Gene Smith, you can see more of those images. Okay, so where am I at with photography? I go out and make my own photographs. I'm not going to show you many of them today. I'm going to show you a couple. But my attitude is I go out and I make pictures of things that I really care about. They happen to be things that are close to me, things that are family-oriented, or things that I somehow become connected to. As an educator, one of the things that I felt was, and what was my experience of growing up, was that I knew that photography could connect with kids. And so we started this program in New York and East Harlem, and these are some of the young people who got out with cameras. And we specifically picked a poor neighborhood because, frankly, cameras cost money, and we wanted to bring cameras in and have them actually document their own surroundings. So this young man is so excited, he jumps up on that go get that perspective as a bird might see something, so he climbs up on the don't walk sign here. And the idea of how, again, I believe our vision is really unique, that each one of us sees the world in a different way. It's like our fingerprint. We're born with our own unique fingerprint. And these are the 2 images that were made by each of the people who you just saw in this previous image. Another thing that I think is really important is that it's important for people to, or particularly young people, to see and experience photographs. What we would do when we first started the project, we would take our young people into museums that had collections of photographs. We actually wanted them to photograph in East Harlem, which was their neighborhood. It was poor, and they said, well, I won't go to South Street Seaport where the tourists go and photograph there. But we really wanted them to sort of have an experience of photographing from within. So we took them to the City Museum of New York, and they actually had photographs from 100 years earlier. So their neighborhood was actually farmland and sort of that. So we had them check it out. But I think also there's a term that's thrown around a lot called visual literacy. And my connection to visual literacy, or the way that I would describe it, is that I think it's really important to share photographs with young people, because as they grow up with them, they can start to make decisions about what they think is appropriate or isn't appropriate, so that when they get to a point in their lives where there's a photograph that's a violation of something, they're better equipped to make those kinds of decisions. And it's also important for young people to be able to talk about the emotions in photographs, to be able to talk about the different kinds of things that connect to them. So we did this project in one of the Hutterite colonies in central Montana, and the excitement that the young people had just looking and talking and being a part of photographs is something that I get to stand back and watch, and is really empowering, I think. So here's a self-portrait. This picture is about Stephen D. Stephen D took this picture, he himself. This is a picture called a self-portrait. So the idea of seeing yourself in an image and talking about it and thinking about it, I think, really has the power to have us think. A lot of times we sort of think that only our heroes or people who are celebrities are going to be the subjects of photographs. And that comes, I think, from our culture, where we look into the television screen and we see images on the television. Oh, there's Michael Jordan, or there's Oprah Winfrey, but I can't be that. But why can't you? And so part of the idea of having people photograph each other is that, yes, you can be that person, or you can be your own person. And I like the beginning of this one. This is a picture that shows a 14-year-old native girl who is pissed off at her father for having her come and do this stuff. And the thing that I really like about having people talk about the way they feel, and particularly young people, is that they're going to put it out there. They're going to tell you what they think about. They're going to tell you about what they feel. We did a project on the Lower East Side in a small school called the Earth School. These were 5th and 6th graders, and we wanted to have them write about their pictures, and we also wanted to have them make pictures and kind of bring those things together. This is kind of a romantic version of the garden, and his name is kind of cut off, but Hawk Sanchez, who actually wrote this, was kind of a tough street kid, and it's interesting to kind of see that other side of him. This picture is all about feet and a dog's butt, and that's what I like about that idea of, just being really connected to what you're thinking in terms of what Octavia felt about this picture. So we had them photograph their neighborhood. We had them, in some cases, take on different processes. This is where photograph's been hand-colored. And this photograph, you almost can't see it's a photograph anymore, but it's been painted really heavily. But just allowing the process of photography to kind of connect with other ways of working. One of the processes we do is something called a cyanotype, which is a 19th century process. And it's a photogram image, and a photogram image is a camera-less image made by using objects in contact with light-sensitive, in this case, emulsion. So that same group of kids were actually working in the garden on the Lower East Side, and they took things from the garden, and they were making pictures from the garden, just using different objects and shapes. And it's really cool. The gum wrapper starts to appear in there. It's not just all natural, but it's sort of a personal indicator in some ways. One day I was standing there, and the students weren't doing anything, and I was sort of like, well, how do we get them motivated? So I took my shoe off, and I put my shoe on the paper and exposed it so they could see it, and just to try to get them fired up. And then one person made this image, which was much more interesting than mine. And then the shoe became sort of a connector. In other words, they're more obscure than these, but they started combining different things, and the process of making pictures really started to take off. Carlos was actually a young man in the class who was really good at painting and drawing. He just sit there and sketch things, and he went out and got these objects and put them together, and he made this picture, and he sort of thought about it, and he said, nah, I don't really like that, I'm going to rework it, and came back. So he went back, and this was his next image that he made, which is really characteristic of the kinds of things that he liked to draw. One of the things we had them do is we had them make their own cameras. So this is Reginald, and he's on the ground. He's got his finger over the pinhole of his camera, which is a box camera. And we wanted to have them work this way. It was like they were kind of complaining about it because it's kind of slow, and why can't we have those fancy cameras that you can wind and click really quickly? But we had them work with those initially, but we wanted them to slow them down so they could really start to look at images. This is his pinhole picture, the one that's kind of where the camera was looking up. They're softer. They tend to be more impressionistic. This young man is actually balancing his camera on the branch in the garden that we worked in. And this is Octavia. We also had them keep notes. We had them keep a journal sort of about what they're doing, because you can't look through the pinhole camera. You have to kind of keep track of what you're doing, so the next time if you do something you like, you can repeat those actions. Here's another pinhole picture of a flower and a cactus. But what was interesting about the process was that once they went back to the other cameras, the way they saw had really evolved. So a couple more pinhole images. And this is a picture made after that. And what the process allowed them to do is to start to look through things and to become more connected to their subjects. This is another one after the pinhole images. And I cheated a little bit. I should have probably showed you a few before, but I didn't. One of the things, again, I'm kind of moving back between different parts of the city, so we're back in East Harlem now. One of the ideas was the issue of how you see yourself and how you might portray yourself. So this self-portrait was set up by this young man, and this is a text that he wrote. Actually, someone else had written in the class, but he felt was sort of connected to the way he felt in terms of the image of how we all have this image about how other people might see us. And this is a young man who's photographing the feet of his friend. And he was really envious of his friend because his friend was the tallest kid in the class, and even in middle school he was tall enough that he could jam the basketball in the basket. So what he did is even though he wasn't tall enough, he made this self-portrait. And the self-portrait was based on the idea of after jamming the ball in the basket, what he would feel it would look like coming back down to the ground. So he's kind of looking up in this idea of what had happened just after he had done that. And this is actually a poem that kind of went with that image. One of the projects we did in East Harlem is probably the poorest neighborhood in Manhattan. It's a place where it's tough to grow up. Some people have described it as a place where all the drugs in New York come into, and then they're dispersed throughout. And so the people who live in that community tend to be the most recent immigrants. They tend to be the people who kind of sort of come to this country. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to work with some young people who were adept at drawing and who were thinking about different ideas. And the idea that we had for them was we came up with the title called Revisions of El Barrio. El Barrio is another name for East Harlem. And we wanted them to find a site in East Harlem, and then we wanted them to recreate that site into anything that they wanted to. We sort of put the idea that they were visionary architects, and we wanted them to look into the future and to think about how they could evolve any space that they chose. So we went out and walked the neighborhoods, we had them look around, and then we went out a second time and we had them photograph the sites that they had picked. And they made black and white photographs like you see in this one. And then we would go back to the studio and we would have them do mock-up drawings about how they might evolve the space. This is Tasha's picture. She's sort of working on these drawings. And then ultimately, this is the image that she transferred or moved it to. You can see the photograph is underneath. We actually did a layover so that they could actually sort of draw, and so you could kind of see some of what the original image looked like beforehand. Vincenti wanted to do McDonald's, and we were sort of saying, well, we have to get that commercial. We sort of didn't want to, give McDonald's a bunch of credit necessarily. But he sort of looked at McDonald's into the future, and he actually looked at McDonald's instead of being a fast food restaurant as a high quality restaurant. And so he started doing these mock-up drawings, but he also thought about it as in the terms of the future. So you can see this guy blasting off on top of McDonald's there. And this was his first pencil mock-up drawing. And if you look at it, you can see that the cars are hovering. The McDonald's actually has a doorman that let people in, and the sign flying above it actually has the special of the day. And you can see people are zooming in and zooming out of his scene there. This is actually Nelson's work, and I'm just going to read a quick thing that he said. Actually, it's Mario's. I saw this spot, but I kept quiet. And then as soon as I got here, I started drawing. But I'd seen this drawing before even I did it. The drawing was done in Central Park. I drew a Buddha. Some people believe deeply in the region of the Buddha. As soon as I saw this spot, I knew that this is where my Buddha should go. And so this was his rendering from that. Nelson said that this photograph is just an empty parking lot or an abandoned place. I was looking at it for a while and I was thinking, you don't have a lot of stuff. You could do a lot of stuff with an abandoned building. So they don't have a lot of drive-through restaurants around here. So I was thinking maybe I could make a drive-through restaurant. That's exactly what I did. I made a restaurant called Sunny Day Restaurant. It's a drive-through. You can buy food. I used yellow, orange for the sign, Sunny Day, and the colors black, red, and blue to attract people. The speaker, there's a speaker so you can talk through it and you can order your food, and it's in the colors of the Puerto Rican flag. Now, Mario and Nelson didn't know each other before the class because we recruited young people from different schools. And Nelson actually made this aquarium, Mario made this aquarium image at nighttime. And Nelson became such a good friend of his that when he made this pet cemetery, he actually includes Mario's aquarium in the back of his picture. Let's see if I can find Matthew. Matthew was our absentee person. In fact, he would get there, he had all this energy, but he actually missed when we were photographing, and so he was actually borrowing another picture. But he loved this cops and robbers thing that was a big theme of his work. And he decided to borrow one of Vincenti's pictures, which is this one. And we got to switch. Thanks, Taylor. What he did is he decided he wanted to try and totally evolve it. In this first slide that you'll see when we get this tray on here, you'll see what he means, but let's see if we can get it. Thanks. So this was his first mock-up. And then the next one he did was he really became interested in this idea of a prison in Central Park where people would sort of be kept. What he said is that You know, almost every year the crime rate is going up, so I figured that even if they started making prisons all over the world, then that soon there might not be any room for prisoners. This prison is located in the middle of Central Park. The tower is there. The guards can have a better watch over the prisoners when they go for walks. There's a gold mine in the middle, and the security guard collects the gold, and he has an agreement with the president about how to get the gold. So this kid was really, obviously, he read the papers and he was really connected. He understood what society was about. He understood who he was in it. And he was this great sort of connection between him and the image. Let's find it. See if we can have it over here. Erica said about her picture, seeing the dog and people walking by, I got excited. I was thinking of a few people who I know who had died. The picture looked kind of sad, so I put in sun, clouds, faces, and rainbows for happiness. Erica lost a lot of her friends in the Fort Washington area where she lived who were killed in drive-by shootings. And so in a lot of ways, this image for her was something that was really personal. The year before I moved to Montana full-time, I had the opportunity to work in Newark, New Jersey at a small community school called Newton Street School. And we had the young people work with this kind of Polaroid transfer process, which was available at the time. And they started making pictures of each other like this. It was interesting to see them. These bars were actually the gate that was surrounding the school, and in some cases they used those as part of their images in terms of sort of including them. This young woman, Crystal, actually, I didn't know this till after this picture was made, but she decided to set up this self-portrait laying on these bricks that were sort of outside the school. And what her art teacher told me sometime after this was that this was the first time that she had felt comfortable enough to go out in the schoolyard. And she talked about the image to me, about how she wanted to have a picture that was dreamlike and being calm. But what her teacher had told me was that her brother actually had been shot right on the spot in a drive-by shooting after school one day. So the other thing that was really interesting about our young people is that this is an older part of Newark. This is sort of an old Victorian type of house. And it might have been a place that these young people would have aspired to live in, but because they were poor, they lived in the projects. And so this next image is actually a picture of the projects. And the projects in Newark are actually cinder block buildings that are 2 stories high that just run like snakes through the neighborhoods. And they're not very pretty. It's sort of like living in a concrete dormitory. But it's really interesting how this young person made this picture to be as nice a place as home as any place, if you will. The other thing our young people did was that they photographed themselves with things. So you can see this young man has a camera on his neck, but he's also posed in front of the motorcycle because he would like to have a motorcycle. And the one thing that I really think was interesting to see was that the pictures that they made of automobiles, the automobile is a pretty big status symbol in our society. It's nice to have a nice car. We all want to aspire to be able to drive something that we can afford to buy. And they made these incredibly beautiful photographs of automobiles. And I was sort of thinking that wouldn't it be great if a car company and the advertising people who are involved in that could make a connection between these young people who were also responding in terms of the way they saw these things, making incredibly strong images of them, and maybe they could be paid for their work. And here's another one with posing. And this process is kind of all that green that you see. It kind of peels away, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's almost like the car is his aura in this photograph. Jimmy Kelly was part of this group. He was a 6th grader, and he really loved to draw. And we had the instant camera, and as soon as the picture came out, he'd grab it and he would start drawing. So he hand colored himself, and he went on and did this small series of images. Jimmy is Jamelian. Jimmy is Jamonster. Jimmy is It Clown. And then he did me, which is David as the Grimer. One of the projects we did on the Lower East Side in Seward Park High School. Seward Park High School was this old high school that had been in the neighborhood until actually a number of years ago. It had been a place where a lot of the immigrants had gone to school. And they had a really strong newspaper. They had their student newspaper had won a Robert F. Kennedy Award for journalism, and we wanted to go in with photography and connect somehow with the curriculum, and we didn't want to just have photography be its own marching band. So we came up with this idea of doing photo essays because they really didn't use photographs very well in their newspapers. And so we decided to have them come up with different essay ideas. So they photographed the markets, they photographed different people. But one of the essays that the students had wanted to do was this portrayal of their mothers. And so these are images that were made during that project of students actually photographing their mothers and their siblings or their surroundings. And it was really interesting because a lot of these young people were, you wouldn't hear them talking about their mother, but the images that they made, this is a picture made by one of the students looking out their window of their apartment, looking down the street to her mother and her siblings. This one is a little bit hard to see, but this is actually a young woman who was in the class, and her mother's actually working in her job in the sweatshop in Chinatown. And again, really close pictures, really personal, and that idea that, again, when we talk about the idea of photographing, it's great to be a photographer, but what are the kinds of things that each of us are connected to? What are the kinds of things that we care about? These are really moving portraits, I think. And this young person, actually, this is her in the picture. She set up the camera, and she said, what I remembered about my mother was that she always tucked me in at night. And so she sets up her camera on a tripod, and she gets in bed, and she has her mother lean over her like she has remembered for her whole life. Every once in a while, my teaching work crosses into my personal life, because what happens is my students sometimes become my friends. And this young man is Andy. He was 15 at the time. He looks a little bit older in this picture, people tell me. And he had been in our program. One of the things that was important to me, based on how I was raised and some of the experiences I talked about with segregation, was that I worked in a museum that was on the Upper East Side of New York, and it was sort of in the white enclave. It was the rich white money area of New York. And I thought that it would be really important if we could work with East Harlem. East Harlem was several blocks north of there, and it was the poorest neighborhood, and I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea to be able to bring our young people from that neighborhood to the museum, have them be photographers, go back and photograph their neighborhoods. And what would happen is that the thing about photography that seems to be absentee sometimes is in the greater collection of photography, we have these gaps that represent different peoples or different cultures. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get some of the young people, in this case, Puerto Rican kids and Dominican kids who probably haven't had access to photography, to get them to do that, but also what we would get out of it in the bigger picture would be their vision. Their pictures would come to that collection of photography. And so Andy was in our class, and we got these kids to come to the darkroom, and it was really interesting to have them. The darkrooms were in the basement of the museum, and that's where all the students worked. And most of the students who came to the museum were taking weekend workshops, and the workshops were expensive, and it wasn't something everything could afford. And these kids knew when they first came into the museum, they knew that this was not their territory, and they were a little bit shy about it. But as they trained and became photographers, they understood that this actually was their place, because they saw photography on the walls. They understood that they had become photographers, and it made an incredible connection to them in terms of who they were as people. Andy was in our class. He had been in their first term, and he was a kid who used to hang out after class, and he would help me clean up the darkroom after we were printing. And in the second term, he kind of recreated that same habit. And one day he said to me, he said, "David, I've got something really important to ask you." And this is a real street kid, but he would sort of talk, "Yo, what's up, Dave? What's happening?" That was sort of his demeanor. But in this moment, he quieted down for a moment, and he said, "I've got something really important to ask you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "My girlfriend and I are going to have a baby in a little bit, and we'd be honored if you would photograph the event." And I hadn't really had a personal conversation with him before, and I said, "Well, how old are you?" And he said, 15. And I said, "Well, how old's your girlfriend?" He said, "Wanda's 18. And he said, "We'd really like you to do it. We've talked about it." He said, "I've come to realize how important photography is." And I said, "Well, maybe I should meet Wanda and ask her if it's okay with her, because obviously she's going to be doing the work in this whole process." And he said, "Nah, she's cool, she'd be all right." I said, "Well, maybe we should do that." So he invited me to their apartment. He lived in the projects, which in New York are these big, tall buildings. And I went and met Wanda, and I said to her, what do you think about this? And she said, no, we'd really like to, in a very quiet voice, opposite of sort of what Andy was like. So I made some photographs of them, just to have them feel who I was in terms of my presence, but I also felt really incredibly honored by the fact that they would ask me to be part of their lives on that level. Wanda, as I said, was 18, and in a lot of ways, Andy was still a child, but he was obviously going to be the father of this baby. And Wanda, in some ways, was able to be there. Andy's deal was that he lived in an apartment. His mother kept him at home all the time. As soon as he came home from school, she said, you're coming back to the apartment. And it was because he lived in a very dangerous neighborhood. Lots of his friends had been killed in gang stuff or neighborhood stuff. And his mother essentially tried to protect him. And in Wanda's story was that Wanda had been kicked out of her apartment by her father. She got in a big fight with her dad, and her dad disowned her, essentially. And she had no place to go, and so Andy's mom invited her into their home. And she was sleeping on the couch, and Andy and Wanda got together, and she got pregnant. And Andy's mother said, why did you do that? But she also said that what Andy's mother said was that when she was a young person, a teenager, she had been pregnant, and she was in Mount Sinai Hospital in labor all by herself. And when she was screaming and needing someone to be there, the nurses would come in and look down on her and would say to her, see, that's what you get for getting pregnant. And so even though she was upset that Wanda had gotten pregnant by her son, she was going to be there for them, and she thought it was important to be connected. So again, these are some of the pictures that I made of those folks. And we went to the birthing clinic, and we went to the, I just kind of followed them around. And then she got really big. Now this is the birth of the child. Now what happened was, I should sort of back up and tell you a little bit before. We'll just leave it up there at this point. Andy calls me and said, Wanda's in labor, and come running over. So I went running over, and I got there, and the midwife came out and said, Wanda has a bowel obstruction, which is preventing her from having her child at the moment, and I really need to work with her and get her to be focused. So do you mind staying in the next room, and when this is cleared, she'll have a normal birth? And I said, sure, well, of course. I mean, I'm not the event here. And so that occurred, and what happened was that as soon as that obstruction was cleared, Wanda had her baby really, really quickly. And it happened so fast that I could hear it in the next room, and they go, oh, where's David? It's too late. So I came rushing in and made this picture, but what was important was that Andy was a photographer. You can see in this picture he's got the camera strap around his neck, and what I could hear from the room on the other side of the wall was that he was coaching her and saying, you can do it, and he kept talking to her and saying, I'm making pictures. And so for me, it was an honor to be there and to do that, and it would have been great to have a picture of their child's birth. But as important, it crossed over to who I was as an image maker, because I was this proud teacher now who saw one of my students fulfilling everything that, the student needed to do. And this is his mom, and this is just moments after the baby was born. And the other thing that happened is that Wanda was actually torn when the baby came out, and she needed some help right away. And in this picture, Andy all of a sudden had to become a father because she needed some care. It turned out that it wasn't something that was tragic. She had a cut, and they were able to kind of get her to the emergency room, and everything was fine. So I arrived in Montana in 2000, and I'm like, I want to work out here. I want to bring the community stuff that I've been doing in the city to this area. How do I do it? So I called the Arts Council and said, here I am. I want to work. Any ideas? And they said, well, we have this grant that we can provide to you. It would mean that you could do a week workshop, and we could pay for half of it, and you'd have to raise your match, which I was sort of used to fundraising through nonprofits. And I went to, they said, but you have to partner with a local community organization. And there was a YMCA here at the time, and so I went to the Y and said, well, the Arts Council is offering to pay half of my salary if we can raise a match, and I'd really like to do a photography program. And I had cameras and had the interest to want to get going here. And they said, well, the problem we have is that we're a regional YMCA, so we have to, if we do it in one community, we have to do it in 7. And so I called the Arts Council back, can we do 7? Sure, we can do 7. So in that first year that I was here in 2000, the first full year, 2001, the summer, we did 7-week workshops in every reservation community. And we went in and we actually had the young people photograph the community from their perspective and to photograph themselves. And it was that idea that in many ways the whole presence of the whole thing that how do you see the world was really my big question to them. And I showed them lots of photographers' work. I showed them different ideas about how
they might photograph. And what's really interesting is that, again, each of us has our own vision. Each of us has the idea and the things that we care about photographing, whether it's your friend jumping off the playground or the great landscape pictures that we've seen in the history of photography. So we did some events, the parades, the powwow to some degree. And this, for me, I have to tell you, was my introduction to the reservation, because I hadn't been any further from Polson than the supermarket, really. So this allowed me to become immersed into, this place that I had decided to move to. Now, some of these young people you may know as adults now. And I love the idea that this young man has decided he's going to be the monument on this platform. Now, I'm going to slip away from the microphone for a second and let you know that sometimes, like the story of Andy and Wanda, sometimes my work crosses over, and I want to show you what I was telling my students at the time is moving close, really fill the frame, get your image. And so Derek made this picture, and then I made this picture. I'm going to try and hold it up high in the light so you can see it. So my version is he's in close getting the same thing I do, and you can look at it later on, but I've also got his family member who's in here too. And while I'm here, by the way, I forgot to do this at the very beginning, and I meant to, and because I'm away from my podium here for a second, I'm going to do that. I really feel that it's an honor to be able to teach here, and I really feel it's important to honor the presence of the people who are here. And Frank has two great photographs out in front of Johnny and Vic Charlo. And what I meant to do before I turned the lights off was to share with you these two photographs. And I sort of feel like they need to be in here with us. They're out in the hall lobby, but I felt like, so this is Vic's picture, which was made by one of our students. So that's what these podiums were for, and I got going and kind of spaced out, so. And this is my photograph of Johnny. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to run back here. So now, the last few photographs I want to share with you. What I want to say is that I've had real issues with parts of photography. Not everything is something that I feel is benefits or gives us the kind of power that I believe photographs that are authentic can. So one of my big quirks is this publication. This publication makes incredibly beautiful photographs. The photographers go out and around the world. But the problem with it is that the photographs are always made by the photographer going into the place and not being made by the people who are there. And the great example of that was that was this woman, who's an Afghan refugee who was photographed back in the 1990s by Steve McCurry, who's a really important photographer. And Steve McCurry made this photograph, and this photograph of this woman became National Geographic's biggest picture ever known, because what happened is he photographed her and she disappeared and they couldn't find her. And then 17 years later, they go back and actually make a photograph of her again, and they send Steve McCurry in there and they send a film crew in. And what they did is they made the event about finding this person instead of about being about this person. You know, what I remember about National Geographic when I was growing up was how culture was dispersed in this magazine. The problem was that as a child, I remember looking at, well, isn't it interesting that these photographers are focusing on essentially naked women and men in different cultures far away? And that really, as I thought about it as an image maker, I thought, what is that about? What am I learning from that? I'm not really learning anything from that. I'm just sort of thinking that somehow someone has a voyeuristic interest in photographing this way. So Steve McCurry actually got it wrong again, because when he went back the second time, he really didn't communicate with this person. He really didn't make a connection to her, because if you look at her picture, and the one in the next page, is that she's pretty angry about this. And as a photographer, I always sort of think that if someone doesn't want their picture made, that's fine. But if you want to make a picture of someone and you want to try to make a picture that has a feeling of who they are as a person, get in there and find out who they are, talk to them. Obviously that didn't occur in this process. And so, again, I have a problem with National Geographic. This first image that I have up here is Edward Curtis's image, a pretty famous image of his. And it's that idea, it's that same idea. Edward Curtis was a white guy who came in and photographed culture from his perspective. And what I want to do is I want to take just a quick moment to read you just a very short paragraph here by Teresa Harlan, who essentially wrote about that perspective. What native photographers provide is the possibility of a native perspective unclouded by white liberal guilt or allegiance to Western heroes. Yet these possibilities are not guaranteed by race or genetics. For if the photographer picks up his or her camera and approaches image making with the same notions of capturing a proud primitive moment, then we are not getting a native perspective. We are seeing a Euro-American image making traditions in action in native lands. Those images do not carry messages of survival. In fact, they are ominous signal that colonization has been effective in that the Indian can now recognize him or herself only through the outside as an outsider. Native image makers who contribute to self-knowledge and survival create messages and remembrances that recognize the origin, nature, and direction of their native experience and communities. They understand that their point of origin began before the formation of the United States and is directly rooted to the land. These native image makers understand that images they create may either subvert or support existing representations of native people. They understand that they must create the intellectual space for their images to be understood and free themselves from the contest over visual history and its representation of native people. Now, with that thought in mind, when I came here, it was interesting that I really wanted to get involved in a project. And I went to Polson, and the Polson schools, I walked in the door and said, I'm a photographer, I do outreach programming, it's not gonna cost you anything, I'll raise my salary through grants, and I wanna come and work with you. And they said, we're not interested. So I drive down towards Pablo, and I walk into Two Eagle River School, and I talk to Clarice, and she says, sure, come on in. And so, in a lot of ways, that was really important. And what I was interested in getting at really was the idea of how can our young people here photograph from their perspective. So these are some of their images. So what's really important about this work is that for 10 years now, we started our 10th year of this project in September or late August. And what we have is a portrayal of this community through the work and the eyes of the young people who make up this community. And at the end of this year, we're going to try and publish a little monograph of their work. And I had to, Ansel Adams is this great landscape photographer, and so when I first got here, I was like, don't photograph the land, photograph yourself. I want you in there. But I didn't understand how important land was. And so we tried to make that connection to the land, but I also wanted them to be in there. So we started assigning the idea of a self-portrait in the landscape, and actually had the combination of the image of the person and how they saw themselves in the context of that land. I'm really excited about this because I think it's really unique in the sense that I don't know of many projects that are based in a community and the pictures are made by those people. So it's really exciting. Now, what predicated part of the idea of this project was that in Dixon, when the school was down in Dixon, George Price was actually teaching photography at that school. And when the school moved up to Pablo, he actually had a darkroom built in there. And so when I walked into Two Eagle and walked in the art room, they said, well, yeah, the darkroom is being used as a closet to store books. And so we got it revived again. But what had happened was that George had actually built an archive of work that his students had done in the time at Dixon. And what happened is after he left his position and moved on to the university, there was an art teacher who came in and actually decided that that archive was of no value and destroyed it, got rid of it. And so here was this archive of images that represented his period of time there that was gone. I got to know him, and a couple of years ago he came to me and said he'd been following the program, and he handed me a small pile of images and said, these are the only ones I happen to have at my house when the move happened, and he gave them to me. And what we've done is this archive is actually
at the school. Actually, it's in my office here at the college because we're starting to edit it. But this archive, at some point, we're going to turn over to some aspect of somewhere in the tribe to be preserved because it's an important document. I don't think we understand the power of photographs, and then all of a sudden, when they're gone, we understand what we're missing. So we've had, again, the process has been about being outside, doing portraits. And actually, I didn't have a print of it. I could have put it up. But here's a picture of Johnny, and it was done by his nephew. And the great thing is that I think this is going to be like a picture that in 100 years people remember Johnny R. Lee by. And what's really wonderful about that is that it was made by a young person from this community. The last thing I want to say before we turn the lights on is I want to acknowledge, I've got my list of acknowledgements here. I want to thank Anita for putting this together and for including me, and Dr. Ross for including me in her series. Julie Kajun and Jennifer Green are two people who I met when I first came here, and were incredibly generous and helpful to allow someone who is a total outsider to come in and throw some ideas around and actually allow me to work with them within this community. Dr. Frank Tyro is an incredibly important person. He had the insight to build the media center, but also to bring photography to this institution, and then gave me my chance to start teaching here. So I'm eternally grateful. I'm really grateful to Stacy Sherwin, who I'm working with sort of commercially on campus, doing some work for them. As I mentioned, Glenn Aragon was also someone who's been really important to me. Corky and Co. Carew were people who I met when I first came here, who were incredibly encouraging to me and have always sort of been there throughout. Shelley Fyant and Clarice King, who allowed me to come in. I'm grateful to John Jarvis, who's here in the crowd. He has allowed us to bring our students from SKC to his site every year since I've been able to do that. And they really kind of respond to that. Roy, who's here as well, is really an important person. Roy and I have this agreement that if one of my students is looking for me and they ask him, that I have to give him $1 each time. So I suspect that I'm probably going to be paying for much of his retirement at whatever point I ante up for that. And then finally, I want to just acknowledge my partner and wife, Jill, who isn't here, but I've been fortunate in my life to have someone who is my best friend and the closest person in my life who kind of puts up with my idea of trying to do this program. We don't always get the funding. In the case of the Two Eagle program, there have been years that I haven't been able to get paid because we couldn't get the grant money together. But she goes out and has a regular job and has been generous enough to kind of share and to fill in those gaps for me as we do the work. Because I think that for me, this idea that in 100 years, if some of the work that comes out of this project can be part of the bigger collection of photography, then we've done that. And the last thing is really that, I want one of our kids from Two Eagle to go off and get really excited about photography and come back and replace me, because there should be someone in that position who really is about this place. Thank you.